I went to visit my girlfriend and her family in Lawrence. During the holidays her dad enjoys exploring and her parents are night owls. Then one night we all decide to go to Stall Cemetery, which was about 20 minutes away from her house. It was around 4 a.m. and my girlfriend's mother chose to stay home, so her father, she and I decide to go there. When we arrive we park near a church across from the cemetery. I was feeling a bit scared because her dad had told us that the town doesn't let outside people into the cemetery, and usually there's a police officer here to stop people from going in, but this time there wasn't any. When we got out of the car it was so quiet, almost like the air was heavy and stopping the wind. We left the car and crossed the street. As we walked past the graves we noticed a dead tree standing alone at a turn that led us up a hill. At the hill's peak there were only ruins left of a church that used to be there. My girlfriend told me that the town destroyed the church in the 90s because lots of people would come and damage it, especially on Halloween. According to a local story, if you threw a glass bottle at the back wall of the church and it didn't break, then Satan would come and take you to hell. The remains of it were still there. We walk around and even move things around to see if we could find anything interesting. Unfortunately, we found nothing except for some strange scratches on some of the stones. But it didn't seem like it was done by an animal, but it could have been kids playing around. We searched for another 20 to 30 minutes, then headed behind the church toward the dead-looking trees. We walk around some bushes along the edge. Since it was so quiet, we could hear a car coming from a couple of miles away, so we turn off our flashlights to make sure nobody could see us. Then my girlfriend found a glass bottle near the edge of the church just lying on the grass. It was an empty glass bottle. When she saw that I was about to bend over and pick it up, she later told me she couldn't believe I would touch the glass bottle. Her dad was on my side shining a flashlight on the bottle. As soon as I touched it we heard a strange sound. It sounded like gas or fizzing. Even though the bottle was empty, the sound seemed to be coming from about 15 feet away towards the back of the rubble. Right away her dad and I shone our flashlights toward the noise, but we didn't see anything. About 3 seconds after the fizzing we heard a strange gargling sound and some sort of clicking. It sounded like an animal, but not one. I recognized her father, who had lived in Kansas all his life, said he'd never heard a sound like that before. What was odd was that if it was an animal it should have been scared or woken up earlier, because we had been making noise and walking around for a while. We never found where the sound was coming from. I finally dropped the bottle and took a couple of photos. When I look at those pictures I saw something kind of weird face in one of them in the background. Feeling quite scared we walked back to the car. When we reached it we noticed the lights were on inside. It was the only light in the darkness. As we approached it from a distance, when we got there we checked all the doors and they were all locked and closed. I thought maybe one of us had left the door open, so I got into the car and turned off the light. None of us remembered turning them on when we left. In fact, we remember turning them off because my girlfriend's dad was changing the batteries in one of the flashlights even before we got to. This happened around the middle or end of the 2000s at Greenwood Cemetery in southwest Deter, Illinois, and this cemetery is considered one of the scariest places in the Midwest. It started as a burial ground, then became a mass grave for soldiers during the Civil War. It was also connected to some cult activities. Around that time a big flood washed away many graves a long time ago. My sister Celia has always been interested in creepy things. This caused some issues for her because she was raised by our great-grandparents who were very kind but also very religious. She moved to Dekar, which was turning into a place filled with crime much like it is now. It was already pretty chaotic. In her new house there was a creepy basement room with dirt on the floor. The previous owner, an old man, had passed away and her mom had visited the house Before she mentioned, everything looked very dark, like it had been burnt, so there was already a weird vibe in the house. Celia, my sister, was feeling down because of life struggles and money problems. As a kind of escape, she started going on ghost hunts with her friends. I won't bother telling you their names, because being lazy is fun. They often went to Greenwood Cemetery. It was like a safe place for Celia. In a weird way, she'd go there at midnight with her dog Brutus, who was still alive and a great dog. They didn't experience anything too scary, just some weird noises now and then. Then one night, when she went with her friends, things got really wild the first time. They took lots of pictures. Then one of them went up to a light pole and said, "If there's anyone here with us, knock back." He knocked on the pole, but nothing happened. A little while later, they heard two really loud knocks. They turned around to look, but they didn't see anything. But then suddenly they all felt like time had stopped. It felt like something made them turn their heads towards a gravel road on the other side of a fence. Just as they turned, they all saw two dark shapes running down the road, but these things didn't make any noise, didn't breathe, and seemed like misty clouds, just like in horror movies. Everyone felt frozen, unable to move until the dogs had gone by. Then they hurried out of there, running back to the car. For a whole mile later, Celia looked into it and found out that some others had also seen these dogs before, but it was apparently a rare thing. The pictures they took were packed with colorful orbs of all sizes, but they never made copies. After some time, they gathered courage to return and went to the scariest part of the cemetery, called Hell's Hallow. They were acting mean and talking about how the place wasn't as scary as they thought. They didn't really believe it, but they wanted to see if they could get a reaction, because nothing scary hadn't happened yet. And then out of nowhere, they heard a really scary scream coming from the sky, like a woman being torn apart. They decided to leave again and headed back to their cars. They sat there for a bit and talked when one of Celia's friends had a cat toy laser and was playing with it. While she played with the laser, lights appear in the trees. Celia noticed they form a pattern, two white lights followed by a deep red one. They definitely weren't flashlights or made by people. Then the chain link fence started shaking really hard. They drove away fast, but they felt like something was following them. When they got back home, everything seemed fine until they found there was something strange in the closet and often heard scratching and growling sounds coming from inside. After their experience at Greenwood, Brutus the dog always seemed scared in the house. Also, some doors in the basement would open by themselves, especially the one near the dirt room. There were often stomping sounds coming from different rooms, especially when someone was alone. People would hear their names being called while they showered, especially Celia. I think whatever it was, it attached itself to Celia the most because of her dark emotions, and this really fueled the entity. There was one time when she was alone with Brutus at night during a power outage, but then she turned and saw a shapeless dark shadow moving over the furniture and drifting down the hall. She grabbed Brutus and sat on the porch for hours until the others came home. They had rent the house to a guy before, but he left about a week later, probably because he experienced something strange too. She often has dreams that seem to predict the future or give her warnings, but she turned her life around and found her faith in Christ again. It seems like this has kept away any darkness that might have still been lingering around. When I was 19, my friend Sean, who was a big goofball, came over to chill in our basement as he often would during the summer. I remember he had a Coke bottle in his hand and I was eating Wendy's when he said we should check out that creepy little cemetery across town. It was the most random idea ever, and I even told him that. Still, we had no school the next day and I knew exactly which cemetery he was talking about. I don't know if one should even call it a regular cemetery. It's just a small plot of land with Maybe 100 tombstones at most, the tombstones very archaic looking, and any time we'd pass there would be no signs of anyone having come to visit within the last decade. The site probably dated back centuries, and it had this super creepy vibe to it because it was closed off by a gothic metal fence and it was surrounded by woods on two sides, the road on one and some old abandoned building on the other. Everything about it just gave scary vibes. It took a little persuading, but Sean managed to get me to want to check it out too. Ironically, it was a very cloudy reddish kind of day, I guess conveniently adding to the mood. Sean pulled up his Honda to the side of the road. I told him to pull up more so it wasn't obvious this was a low traffic road, so it would look kind of suspicious. He pulled up a few 100 feet down the road and we got out and cut through the woods so that any potential passing traffic wouldn't see us entering the little cemetery. Hopping the fence in the woods was easy. It was maybe a 3 or 4 foot fence. Sean kind of took the lead on this since it was mainly his venture. He led us through the eerie little plot of land and we looked at the archaic tombstones. They all seemed to be from the 19th century. The writing on some of them was illegible at that point. I know it sounds super dumb and cliche, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched constantly. I started looking around the surrounding woods. I told Sean how creepy this was. I know, he replied, still with the feeling of being watched. I looked at the abandoned building next to the cemetery at one of the windows. For a brief moment I knew I saw someone standing at the window, even through the fog, smudge and dirt on the glass, but they casually either ducked or walked away from the window. I told Sean we were being watched by someone in that building, and he turned to look at it as well. Then he went to look for the entrance to it. I told him don't. I said we should just leave before we get in trouble. I stayed still by the tombstone he was looking at while he walked around the building, and then he found a way and he called me over, but I stayed put, and I heard some loud kind of crack, so I looked in that direction and there was this older man, probably around 55. Gray hair, had on a black raincoat. I believe he was wearing jeans and he had a mustache, but that's all I really got of him. Then he opened his mouth and screamed, not just yelled, he screamed, "Get out!" He screamed it so loud I thought I saw birds fly away from being startled, and just like that I started to feel lightheaded and suddenly everything went dark. The next thing I remember was waking up to being dragged in the woods. I freaked out thinking I was being kidnapped, but when I turned and got up I saw I was just Sean. Sean was freaking out about something. He told me to follow him and run back to the car, so I didn't ask questions. As we ran through the woods, I heard something close behind me, and when I turned I realized we were being followed by someone, so I ran even faster. We got to his Honda, and he basically put it in drive before the car even had a chance to fully start. When Sean was inside that abandoned building, he found a sigil of bafflement painted on the wood floor, which is basically the sign of Satan. Around it were a bunch of freaky dolls with buttons for eyes. You didn't get to see anything else in the building because he heard the old man scream at me outside. He came running to find me passed out on the floor, and he saw the old man slowly walking over to me. He started to drag me away from the old man and into the woods. He actually literally picked me up and threw me over the fence. To get me out, I quickly came back to consciousness, and that's when we ran. I had only fainted one time in my life, and it was at that moment. I don't know why I fainted, but it happening at a graveyard with some kind of satanic ritual building right next to it makes it that much stranger. My grandfather was always a strong presence in my life. He was the kind of man who commanded respect without ever raising his voice. When he passed away, I felt like a piece of my world crumbled. Visiting his grave became a ritual for me, a way to stay connected to the man who had taught me so much. The cemetery where he was buried wasn't far from my home. It was an old place with towering oak trees and weathered headstones that leaned slightly, as if bowing to time. The paths were narrow, winding through the graves in a way that felt almost intentional, like they were guiding you through the memories of the people who rested there. I visited often, always bringing fresh flowers to place at his headstone. It was a peaceful place, or so I thought. One evening just before sunset, I decided to visit my grandfather's grave. The sky was a dull orange, the sun hanging low, casting long shadows across the center cemetery. The air was cool with a slight breeze that rustled the leaves above. As I walked along the familiar path, I noticed how quiet it was. Even the birds seemed to have gone silent, leaving only the sound of my footsteps on the gravel. I reached my grandfather's grave and stood there for a while, lost in thought. The headstone was simple, just like the man it marked. I placed the flowers at its base and said a few words, my voice barely above a whisper. As the shadows grew longer, I felt a chill creep up my spine, but I brushed it off as the cooling evening air. With a final look at the headstone, I turned and made my way back to my car. Just as I reached the cemetery gates, my phone rang. The sound was startling in the silence, and I fumbled for a moment before pulling it out of my pocket. The screen showed an unknown number, but I answered it anyway. "Hello," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the stillness. For a moment there was nothing but silence on the other end. Then a voice spoke, low and familiar. It was my grandfather's voice. "Why did you leave so soon?" he asked, the words slow and deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It couldn't be him. It wasn't possible. He was gone. I knew that, but the voice on the other end of the line was unmistakably his, so intense that I nearly dropped the phone. "Who is this?" I stammered, but there was no response. The line went dead, leaving only the faint sound of the wind through the trees. I stood there, phone still in hand, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My legs felt weak, and I leaned against the cemetery gate for support. Eventually, I convinced myself that it had to be a prank, someone with a sick sense of humor. The voice had been too real, too familiar. The next day I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The memory of that voice haunted me, echoing in my mind every time I closed my eyes. Despite my fear, I knew I had to go back to the cemetery. I needed to see my grandfather's grave to reassure myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The sun was bright that day, casting sharp shadows across the ground as I walked the now familiar path. Everything looked the same as it always had, the trees, the headstones, the narrow paths winding through the graves, but something felt different, an unease that I couldn't quite place. As I approached my grandfather's grave, I stopped in my tracks. There, a few feet away from the headstone, stood a figure. It was my grandfather. He looked just as he had when he was alive, dressed in his usual clothes, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, as if he had been waiting for me. I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were rooted to the ground, and my breath caught in my throat. A chill ran down my spine, colder than anything I had ever felt before. My mind screamed at me to run, to get as far away from that place as possible, but my body refused to obey. Then slowly my grandfather's face began to change. His skin grew pale, his eyes hollow, his mouth twisted into a grimace that was nothing like the gentle smile I remembered. It was as if I was looking at a reflection of him, distorted and wrong. The figure took a step toward me, and that was when I finally found the strength to move. I turned and ran, not daring to look back. The path blurred beneath my feet as I sprinted toward the gate, my heart pounding in my ears. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers trying to hold me back. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The fear that gripped me was stronger than anything I had ever felt. When I finally reached my car, I threw myself inside and locked the doors, my hands trembling. I sat there for a long time, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my eyes fixed on the cemetery gate. I half expected to see the figure standing there watching me, but the gate remained empty. I never went back to that cemetery. I couldn't. Whatever I saw that day, whatever called me on that phone, it wasn't my grandfather. It was something else, something that should never have been disturbed. The memory of that day still haunts me.